The ultimate guide to Donald Trump's foreign policy doctrine is today's topic of Hammer Time. So stick with me for the next 40 minutes to understand precisely what the geopolitical strategy of the current US administration actually is. Now, the term that I would use, which I think describes it best, and this is from a good friend who is on Substack under the name of the Broad Street Journal, is the so-called DonRoe Doctrine. And the idea of the DonRoe Doctrine is that it's Trump's geopolitical reorganization of the Western Hemisphere. And to give a little bit of historical context, in 1823, James Monroe, the fifth president of the United States, established the so-called Monroe Doctrine. And the Monroe Doctrine was a foreign policy declaration that made unambiguously clear, this was quite, I would say, significant at the time, to the European colonial powers, to the European empires, that they had to stay out of the Western Hemisphere, so North America and South America. And now, over 200 years later, Donald Trump is pursuing a strikingly similar strategy, except this time, of course, the competitor is not Europe, but it's China. What might be called the DonRoe Doctrine, so for Donald Trump, is more than just an entertaining game on words and pure rhetoric. It's a comprehensive American realignment of American foreign and economic policy. And the idea behind it is to create an integrated economic sphere from the southern tip of Latin America up to Alaska and potentially even including Greenland. So all the jokes that they made about annexing Greenland, there is a kernel of truth to it. Maybe not the whole loaf, but definitely something. The parallels to the original Monroe Doctrine are quite remarkable. Yet, of course, as always, there are certain differences. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. But what is absolutely crucial is to understand that the US administration does have a strategy. It's not just erratic reactionary policy or crazy Trump. There is actually a design. Now, whether this strategy is going to work out or not, that's a separate issue. But that there is a strategy can no longer be denied. Now, as I said originally, the original Monroe Doctrine sought to repel European interference, while Trump's version as its target has, of course, China and the growing economic and geopolitical influence that they tried to build in Latin America and the Western Hemisphere. And this is also, of course, a version of American neo-imperialism. Latin America is viewed as America's backyard, so this reinstatement, if you want, of let's call it hemispheric hegemony. So it's no longer the unipolar hegemon or the global hegemon. I think the idea of Trump is to establish himself as the Western Hemispheric hegemon, and this is his answer to the post-war global order that is collapsing. This is an issue we have talked about quite intensively in the past. For those of you who haven't seen it, we did very interesting podcasts with Doomberg, with Michael Avery, with Brent Johnson. Feel free to revisit them. But I think they all make a similar case that, first of all, we have the end of the liberal world order. But what this leads to is the return of a form of mercantilism. And the liberal world order, that was the guiding principle of the post-war period, although we can debate how liberal it actually was. But one of the main mantras was that markets know best. So for decades, we were told that because markets, whether it was in areas of migration, whether it was in production, offshoring, moving productive capacity out of Europe, out of the West, out of the United States, the concept of free trade, like the supposed efficiency of markets was treated as like dogma. It was an inviolable argument. But slowly and surely, a very crucial question started to emerge that everybody understood before 1945. And this is the question, what is the national economy actually for? What is the purpose of GDP, right? This is a question that our friend Michael Avery always asks. What is GDP for? And I think this question has become painfully relevant after the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Western commentators, shortly after the invasion, scoffed that Russia was nothing more than a gas station posing as a country, as the late US Senator John McCain used to say, or that its GDP is smaller than France's, or that it's comparable to Texas. But what all of these commentators were missing is that there is enormous difference whether the GDP of a country consists of olive oil or financial instruments, or as the Economist recently titled of OnlyFans models, or if it's tanks. Russia proved capable of producing precisely what was needed to be a geopolitical player and to conduct a war: ammunition, artillery, tanks, shells. Now, Western economies, by contrast, have absolutely forgotten that in order to prevail in a military conflict or a militarized world, you need to be able to produce these things in mass quantities. And the West can no longer do this. According to Mark Rutte, who is the Secretary General of NATO, Russia is producing 3 to 4 times the ammunitions and the artillery shells than all NATO states combined. And I think that tells you everything you need to know. Now, this does not necessarily mean that the Russian operations and the Russian war in Ukraine is going according to plan. But I think it does show that despite all the rhetoric, how easily the Europeans could defeat the Russians if you simply compare the GDP, well, that alone is not the most important element. Geopolitically, we increasingly see that outsourcing crucial elements and crucial ingredients of your industries, whether it's semiconductors, whether it's pharmaceutical products, whether it's rare earth, it might make sense from a market perspective, but from a security and geopolitical perspective, it absolutely did not. And this is, I think, the realization that is slowly it falls like scales from everybody's eyes. If you want to compare the global geopolitical situation to a board game, it's no longer monopoly, it is risk. And I think this is the new world order, or the new worlds that we have to come to grips with. That international competition has now become a complex struggle for geopolitical dominance, and not something that is only defined by the need for market shares and profit maximization. I mean, take industrial robots, for example. China installed approximately 295,000 new industrial robots in 2024. 10 times more than Germany and almost 9 times more than the United States. The Beijing, the Middle Kingdom, is systematically preparing itself for the post-human future, right? With the demographic problems and problems of an aging population will be solved by robotics and artificial intelligence. And at the same time, Europe and America are still debating whether industrial policy is compatible with the free market. Maybe it is in some areas, but overall the direction is clear that economics is now another tool in the geopolitical kit, in the geopolitical toolkit. And things that could become an issue for national interests, for security policy, will probably, in certain areas, be taken out of the hands of the market and will be determined, to whatever extent that remains to be seen, by state and government policy. So many of the things that at a first glance over the last couple of months appeared chaotic, if you think about supposedly arbitrary tariffs, aggressive trade policies, unconventional trade deals, and going back and forth, does in fact follow a clear strategic logic, which is the creation of an integrated economic hemisphere and an integrated economic sphere, excluding China. Now, the big paradox or the irony is that this vision is not unlike the European Union, which is of course a political project that Trump very much likes to criticize. But the crucial difference is that it's a project that concerns the United States in the broader sense. And by this I mean that it's no longer just about the United States of America, but it is about the United States of the Americas. And if we look at some of the economic fundamentals, this vision by Trump is actually supported. The Western Hemisphere possesses immense energy resources, a large population, significant raw material reserves, and everything you would need to decouple yourself from China. South America contains 40% of the world's copper reserves, 35 to 40% of lithium reserves, as well as significant deposits of nickel, cobalt, and other critical minerals. Now, it will take a while to make these available, but we can already see within the Trump administration and the policies that this is where the journey is supposed to go. Now, there's a lot of tit for tat going on between China and the United States. It is questionable who has escalation dominance at the moment, But it is clear that whatever we saw in the news recently, that Xi and Trump came to an agreement, this is a respite, a temporary pause. But the overall conflict and the attempts of both sides to get more independent from each other is still moving on. I would argue that you could say that Trump's industrial policy is resting on three distinct pillars. One is reindustrialization. That is a clear goal. The other one is the resilience of supply chains. And the third one is strategic investments by the government in the private sector. And I think the goal is quite clear: to bring critical production capacities back to North America. So not just the United States, but North America and even South America to an extent. Build a domestic industrial base that is not dependent on China, or where dependency on China can be kept at a minimum. And the core element of this strategy is direct state participation in strategically important companies. And that's, by the way, quite a novelty in American economic history since 1945. But just to give you a few examples, in July 2025, the Pentagon announced a $400 million investment in MP Materials, which made them the largest single shareholder with a 15% stake in America's only rare earth mining company. They also made a very specific purchase agreement. The Pentagon committed to buying all magnets produced in a new magnet factory for 10 years, guaranteeing a minimum price of around $110 per kilogram of neodymium praseodymium oxide. Sounds very complicated, but the important thing is this is more than China charges. But this is not, again, about what is most efficient in the market. It's about what is in the national interest. And this strategy continues in other areas as well. In October 2025, the Department of Energy secured a 5% stake in Lithium Americas, a company that is developing new lithium mines in the United States. A few days later, again in October, the Defense Department announced a 10% holding in Trilogy Metals, coupled with a $35.6 million investment in rare earth and resources exploration in Alaska. Similar deals have been struck also abroad with Australia, with Canada. So overall, the US government is taking stakes in companies nationally and internationally to get from cheap and efficient supply lines to resilient supply lines. And I think that is a very, very important distinction. We see the same in them buying stakes, for example, in the semiconductor chip industry. One of them is the significant stake the government has taken out at the chip maker Intel, right? With I think an investment of almost $10 billion and a 10% ownership by the government. So this is clear government intervention and government ownership in the private sector, at least in those sectors that are seen as crucial and critical for national interests and for security policies. And not everybody, of course, is particularly happy about this. Libertarians and free market champions are rather critical of it. Some of them argue that this is not what the US economy needs, that this is going to be a waste of resources. For example, Tyler Cohen, an economics professor at George Mason University, argues that Trump is transforming major American companies into government instruments. And here's a direct quote from him: "A dose of state ownership and the accompanying politicization is not what American industry and innovation need." Well, maybe not, but it's definitely what American security policy needs. The same argument is made from another economist, Thea Riofrancos of Providence College, who calls it resource nationalism MAGA style. Again, yes, that is true, but I think they all still live in the because markets world, where they say, okay, what is the best from the market perspective? But this is not how the Trump administration looks at it. They look at it, what's necessary, what's the crucial element for national securities. Simon Moores, for example, who is the CEO of Benchmark Mineral Intelligence, I think makes a very good comment. And he said, and I quote here, "It is very rare for Western governments to do this in modern times," talking about the intervention. "It is more of an approach by China and Russia taking stakes in mining companies through state enterprises. Traditionally, the USA would create incentives to have the private sector take on the investment and development burden. But with critical minerals, we face an uneven playing field." And that's absolutely right. You cannot play by the rules if nobody else does. So if Russia, China, India, others have massive state interventions or organize their economies along the lines of the national interest, of course the United States at some point have to do the same thing. And I think this is what Donald Trump is attempting. Now, as I said before, if he's going to be successful, that remains to be seen. But is there a strategy? I think the answer is absolutely yes. Another element that we increasingly see is something that our friend Michael Cow calls the reverse Marshall Plan. And the reverse Marshall Plan is this idea that instead, as it happened after World War II, that the United States are investing massively in Europe, that now the United States are creating conditions where there will be massive investments in the United States. And a particularly sophisticated dimension of this new American strategy is this idea that complexity and sometimes the erratic nature of Trump's policies are part of that plan. So if you look at the trade policies, for example, they are very complex. What is there a tariff on? Where does it apply? What are the exemptions? So it's a labyrinth of regulations, compliance requirements. So a complete nightmare for any company that wants to export to the US market. So why would they do this? Well, sure, one aspect is to get revenue from the tariffs. But even more so, if you make it complicated enough, but foreign companies still want to sell their products in the United States, you create such a complex regulatory framework that foreign companies will simply say, you know what, this is too complicated, this is too complex. Instead of exporting from wherever our main base is, our home base is, we're just going to build production facilities directly in the United States. And I think this is the plan also behind it. So even the regulatory annoyance is part of the plan. So the regulatory labyrinth is one aspect. But there is another one, right? You have then rising compliance costs. You create administrative, logistical, and bureaucratic nightmares that, once again, it will force them to move production to the United States. And the third one is what people call taco. Trump always chickens out, which sounds funny. But in fact, it makes everything unpredictable. So especially if you're an exporter to the United States. So how can you avoid unpredictability, uncertainty? Well, you move your production to the United States as much as possible. Now, again, I'm not saying that this is necessarily working out, but let's not kid ourselves. This is obviously a strategy that is being pursued. Parallel to this, the administration is also pursuing what I already mentioned, and which I think can be described best as a reverse Marshall Plan. And this is no longer the original Marshall Plan that was transferring American resources to Europe in order to finance and support reconstruction. It is a reversal of that logic. And this means that it's supposed to incentivize more direct investments in the United States. And also, by the way, Trump's demand that NATO members spend 5% of their GDP on defense is not just driven by military considerations. They might play a role as well. But Trump knows quite well, and the Americans know quite well, that American defense or European defense industries at the moment, they cannot keep up with all the supposed new funding that is now, let's see if it's going to happen, by the way, but let's assume for a second it does. That all the new funding that is running into the defense sector. So what have these countries available as options? Well, they can only use that money then to invest in American defense contractors, in the American military industrial complex. So by forcing Europeans and Asian countries to increase their commitment to defense spending, this is money that will go into American industries. Now, if everybody then starts to buy stuff at Boeing and Raytheon and at Northrop Grumman and all these other companies, well, this is going to help rebuild the American industrial base. This is going to help strengthen American supply chains. So again, there is a strategy behind this, and we know that the Italians, for example, they tried to reinterpret defense spending as infrastructure spending, so building a bridge between Sicily and the mainland. But the Americans immediately stepped in and said, no. I mean, you can build this bridge, but you cannot count this as defense spending. So this is obviously and quite clearly a strategy that is pursued by the United States. And I think we're going to see more of this in the future. Now, we saw another element of this with Argentina. The Milei connection and the implications, I think, highlight quite nicely the Trump administration's Western Hemispheric policy. So shortly before the elections that took place on October 26 in Argentina, the American government announced a 40 billion rescue package for Argentina, 20 billion in the form of a currency swap line from the Treasury Department and an additional 20 billion through a mix of sovereign wealth fund and private banks. But Trump made very clear that this money is only going to flow if the result of the elections would be to his liking. So he said that if he loses Milei, which he didn't, right, we will not be very generous with Argentina. Now this, which was nothing else but interference by the United States, sparked quite the controversy in Argentina. There was a hashtag that trended in the country called Patria o Colonia, so fatherland or colony. And Peronists like Jorge Diana called Trump, and I quote here, call on Trump to end the extortion of the Argentine people. Cristina Kirchner claimed in a recorded message that the Argentine economy is operated by remote control from the US Treasury Department. And this is not entirely wrong. Although I would say that the Americans, the United States, not really have an interest in controlling or directly controlling the Argentinian economy. They just want somebody in charge whom they can trust, who they believe is going to be a constructive, contributing member of this new Western Hemispheric strategy. And Milei is, whereas other Latin American countries and other Latin American states and their heads of government are not. So the victory then of Milei was most definitely partially a consequence of American intervention. And one can say this is, it's imperialist, it's unfair, it's undemocratic. And to be honest, I think all of these criticisms are correct. But as I said before, the new game in town is not monopoly, it is risk. And the United States saw it in their strategic interest to ensure that Milei will stay in government. And this is precisely what happened. Argentina is strategically important for the United States. It possesses some of the world's largest lithium reserves. In the Val de Muerte, they have gas and oil reserves. So these are all things that are quite of interest for the American industry and also for Trump's goal to keep oil prices in the Western Hemisphere as low as possible. Argentina is also an important soybean producer. So there's a couple of elements that make it a really, really important and crucial partner for the United States. And this, as I said before, whatever your moral judgment on these policies is, I think it is very hard to deny that they follow a strategy. And again, we can say this is immoral. Like, how can Trump do this? Why would the Americans enact what I think one could justifiably call a form of neo-imperial policy? Well, because this is the new game in town. As I can only repeat what I said before, that the times where every country can do as they please and trade and interact and make agreements with everyone they want, this is over. In some areas they will have to call whoever the regional hegemon is. So this will be in Asia, increasingly China, and in the Western Hemisphere it's going to be the United States. Now, the first country, or some of the countries that will feel this, one of them is going to be Brazil. Brazil, as a BRICS member, I mean, they are the B in BRICS, likes to pursue an independent foreign policy. But it is very, very unlikely that the Trump administration is going to allow a partner of China to play a crucial role in Latin America. And we see this also in Trump's policies via Venezuela and in his policies via Mexico. So while Argentina is enticed with carrots, the US is increasingly using sticks vis-a-vis other countries. Take Venezuela as an example. Trump has already revived the maximum pressure campaign against Venezuela. He's accusing the country of smuggling large quantities of cocaine and other drugs into the United States, and that might actually be true as well. And he also, in August of 2025, signed a secret directive authorizing the Pentagon to use military force against selected Latin American cartels. Now, as I said before, he might have an interest in defeating the cartels, but this is also a signal to Latin American countries that the United States are both able and willing to interfere domestically in these countries if they are out of line, or if Washington thinks that they're out of line. It's no coincidence that the US bounty on Nicolas Maduro was increased to $50 million. and that there is a small U.S. fleet of, I think it contains around 4,500 sailors, is now off the shores of Venezuela. Like, none of this is a coincidence, and none of this should be seen as a crazy Trump or erratic Trump. Not at all. This is part of a strategy. This is part of America trying to reestablish its dominance, its hegemony, if you will, in the Western Hemisphere. And I think everybody who is not attuned to this, and also of course in Europe, in the United Kingdom, at some point a choice will have to be made if you want to be part of the US dominated Western Hemisphere or something else. And if you pick the something else, be it China, be it Russia, or whoever, you have to understand that this will then turn the United States not into a neutral observer, it will turn them into an antagonistic power. So if you take the European condition at the moment, for example, where we are increasingly depending on energy, particularly liquefied natural gas from the United States, which I don't think is going to happen, if, however, let's say the Europeans would decide to choose China in this conflict, it cannot be ruled out that the United States would say, well, this is your choice, but please don't expect American energy continuing to flow into your direction. We have not talked about the dependency of the European banking system on swap lines from the US Federal Reserve and the US banking system. So if they would want to, they could collapse Europe's financial system. We are heavily depending on their tech sector. I mean, pretty much every major software, whether it's on social media or elsewhere, that is being used in Europe, with few exceptions, is dominated and controlled by the United States. I mean, could the United States hypothetically ban Twitter, Facebook, Meta, Microsoft from operating in Europe? Well, in the past, one would have said no. But I think if we look where the journey is going, with the United States putting more pressure, in kind of mirroring, if you will, the policies of China and the policies of Russia, but that the potential exists that they will then put pressure on these companies to stop their engagement in Europe, is something that at the moment is unlikely. But could it happen? Absolutely. So I think if we take this broader view, and there was recently a headline in the Financial Times that America will be pushing for more dollarization of other countries, that they might, I think we will see with the so-called Genius Act, that there will be a new digital currency program, a kind of a stable coin implementation that will be backed by US treasuries. So these are, of course, also bookkeeping tricks to ensure that the United States can manage their own massive debt. And the point of this presentation, of this podcast, is not to say that everything the United States do is perfect or is good or is morally worthy of approval. It is just a way to say, listen, something is going on. So the judgment, if you will, whether or not this strategy is going to be successful, that is still out. The jury on that is still out. But there is a strategy. And I think every piece of news that comes out and every negotiation should be looked at through this lens of on the one hand, the US-China competition. Again, this does not mean that this competition will turn into a war, that it will turn violent, but the competition is there. And both sides try to position themselves as beneficially as possible. I will talk about the Chinese case in another podcast. But America is pursuing a strategy of decoupling, and at the same time pursuing a strategy of Western Hemispheric integration. So I would always keep an eye out on what's going on in Latin America, the way the United States act there, and of course to what extent the United States are willing to open up these Western Hemispheric project to the Europeans, to the UK, to the Australians, to India, to New Zealand. I think there's a lot going on there. I hope that this podcast sheds some light on this, but the main purpose of this was to say that there is a strategy. Don't be fooled by media reports that Trump and his administration have no idea what they're doing. They know very well what they're doing. Now, what I cannot tell you is whether or not this strategy is going to be successful. But what I can tell you is that there is a strategy. And more on this in the next podcast. Please consider subscribing to the Brussels Signal YouTube channel. There is much more content coming your way. I think you will not regret it. We will try to provide you with up-to-date information and the perspective that, while factual, is one that you probably do not get from other media outlets. Thank you very much. Bye.